Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're embarking on a pretty fascinating journey into the recent writings of Chris Abraham. He's a really keen observer of modern power dynamics.
Yeah, he definitely offers some unique perspectives.
We've got a collection of his recent essays,
Yeah.
and they really give this panoramic view of current events, everything from geopolitical conflicts, shifting foreign policy.
Very true to domestic political fights and this growing problem of us not even agreeing on basic reality anymore.
Exactly. So our mission today is to unpack Abraham's arguments, which are, let's say, provocative, about how the American empire operates, not just overseas, but right here at home, too.
And how narratives, plus this really strange idea he calls empathy fatigue, are kind of reshaping everything.
Yeah, get ready for some surprising insights, I think, and maybe a few moments that make you go, aha.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so let's unpack this first idea. The traditional picture of empire, flags and boots on the ground. Abraham says that's not really it anymore.
Right, he thinks it's way more subtle now.
He talks about a soft power American empire. Says conquest happens more through, like, keikis, lanyards, conference calls.
Exactly. Instead of just brute force, he argues the U.S. uses things like branding, grants, think tanks even.
Huh. So the tools are different.
Totally. He says our imperial insignia is basically a hashtag now, and the colonies are ideological, not physical territories.
He points fingers at specific organizations.
He does. He mentions places like USIA, the IMF, the World Bank, Open Society Foundations, and suggests that while their missions sound good, modernize, democratize, stabilize, in practice, he argues, they can actually create dependency, debt, and become ways to extract data.
So the power is hidden in these systems we see as normal or even helpful.
That's his core point. It's embedded, making it harder to even spot, let alone resist.
Okay, so building on that soft power idea, he then brings in something much darker. He calls it the doctrine of rubble. That's what's that about?
Yeah, it's a pretty stark term. Abraham takes a really strong line against all forms of regime change.
All forms, so not just military invasions.
Nope. Overt military action, sure, but also the subtler stuff. NGOs getting involved, IMF leverage, what he calls soft power psyops.
And he connects this to specific plans.
He references that alleged blueprint from General Wesley Clark, the one about taking down 7 countries in 5 years: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Iran.
Right, I remember hearing about that.
Abraham describes it not as nation building, but as a deliberate plan for collapse and what he calls managed entropy, basically leading to rubbleization.
Rubbleization. Wow, so just breaking things.
Pretty much. Reducing a state to, well, rubble, a shattered, unmanageable place.
And Abraham uses some, let's say, really provocative examples to back this up. What stands out?
Well, yeah, they're definitely designed to make you think. He argues, very controversially, that someone like Saddam Hussein was, in a weird way, the hero of the Iraq War.
The hero. How does he justify that?
Because, despite his obvious brutality, Abraham claims he kept Iraq sovereign and whole. And similarly, with Gaddafi's Libya, he claims it had the highest standard of living in Africa before, as he puts it, it was blown up by intervention.
So his point is the intervention was worse than the dictatorship it removed.
That's the argument, that these actions shattered countries, led to, the ongoing sectarian violence in Iraq, or even, he notes, open-air slave markets in Libya.
Grim. And he sees this pattern elsewhere, too.
Oh, yeah. Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, Venezuela, Cuba. He puts them all in this category, contending that America, through sanctions and destabilization, basically acts as the bad guy.
Seeking what? Control.
He says obedience, not order, because, in his view, a broken state is easier to manage than a proud one. It's a very cynical take on foreign policy aims.
So with this rubbleization idea in mind, how does he look at the war in Ukraine? He has a controversial view there, too, right? Saying the U.S. provoked it.
He does. He sees the 2014 Maidan Revolution not as a popular uprising, but as a regime change-up.
A U.S.-backed operation.
Right. That's his interpretation. And he views everything that's happened since as basically theater, which he believes has ultimately left Ukraine no longer sovereign.
So a pawn in a bigger game.
He calls it a proxy battlefield and bait. And he tries to humanize this view with a personal story about meeting a young Iranian girl in Berlin, contrasting her, vibrancy in life with how Iran is often demonized. He thinks that demonization is part of the strategy turn a place into an abstraction, just an idea.
Before you turn it into rubble.
Exactly. And he concludes, the devil you know is often better than the devil you invent. He's really pushing back against accepted narratives.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit.
Uh-huh.
What about America's relationship with Israel? Abraham seems to think it's more complicated than just alliances.
Yeah, he argues it's something deeper. Almost like in the American psyche, Israel functions as a kind of spiritual twin or a mirror.
A mirror, what does that reflect?
A sort of condensed, maybe morally clearer version of what America thinks it is or wants to be. He says Israel is often portrayed as acting decisively, where America might, hesitate.
Retaliating instead of apologizing.
Right. Seen as maybe the last Western nation really believing in real sovereignty, decisive violence, and no shame in survival. That's his phrasing.
And pop culture reinforces this.
He claims it does. Think about how Israeli operatives are often shown these mythical fixers, almost like blue fairy godmothers, just hyper-competent. He even throws in that detail about Dr. Ruth, the sex therapist.
Sister Ruth. What's the connection?
Apparently she was once a Haganah sniper. Abraham uses this to symbolize what he sees as Israel's duality, both nurturing and lethal.
Wow, okay. So she takes this idea and connects it directly to recent events, specifically this alleged bombing of Iranian nuclear facilities by Trump in June 2025.
Yes, he reads that alleged act as not just strategic, but highly symbolic.
Symbolic of what?
He positions Israel as Trump's last real state ally, particularly in a world where Trump might feel like a pariah. So the bombing becomes, in Abraham's view, a kind of spite war.
Spite war. Driven by what? Domestic issues?
Partly, yeah. Abraham suggests Trump was frustrated because his big domestic plans, the Make America Rich Again stuff, through mass deportations and tariffs, were getting sandbagged.
Sandbagged, you mean like blocked?
Exactly. Obstructed by courts demanding more process, more bureaucracy.
And Abraham sees the deportation plan itself differently, too. Not just about immigration control.
Right. He argues it was conceived as a kind of economic stimulus, just dressed up as moral clarity.
How would that stimulate the economy?
It would require, supposedly, a massive wartime budget for detention centers, legal processing, a kind of New Deal for nativists, as he puts it.
Okay, so when those domestic stimulus routes were blocked.
Abraham suggests Trump reached for the foreign war lever. Why? Because Abraham says, war is bipartisan, procedural, immune to injunctions. It's a way to act decisively when other paths are blocked.
But wait, doesn't this unwavering support for Israel, maybe even initiating conflict, clash with Trump's whole no more world police promise?
That's a key question. But Abraham argues, interestingly, that it doesn't break the promise.
How does he figure that?
He says Trump never promised total isolation or abandoning allies. What Trump rejected, in Abraham's reading, was bureaucratic adventurism. The U.S. acting like the global HOA, the Homeowners Association, meddling everywhere.
So America first isn't isolationism.
Not according to Abraham. It's about strategic restraint, focusing on clear national interests. And Israel, having its own strong military, isn't asking the U.S. to fight its battles just.
Not to abandon it when things get critical.
Exactly, when the cost of staying neutral becomes existential. For Abraham, this approach offers strategic clarity. It's rooted in practical realities, realpolitik, and restraint backed by force.
Characterized by Trump's lack of shame, as he puts it.
Yeah, that absence of shame in picking sides and sticking to them.
Okay, let's bring this home now. How does Abraham see this whole regime change mentality playing out domestically? He talks about a kind of civil war between two rival empires.
Yeah, he really dives into the internal conflict. He looks at Jon Stewart's criticism of McGee using, Iraq war-style regime change rhetoric against opponents. And Abraham turns it around. He says, well, hold on. The institutional left is doing the exact same thing, just using different weapons.
Different weapons like?
Things like lawfare, using the legal system as a weapon, ballot access lawsuits, trying to keep opponents off the ballot, platform bans, algorithmic suppression online.
Right, deplatforming and shadow banning.
Weaponized leaks from the intelligence community, he claims, and even what he calls cultural censorship wrapped in DEI language.
What does he mean by that last one? DEI language as censorship.
He's suggesting that sometimes the language and concepts around diversity, equity, and inclusion are used, in his view, to shut down certain viewpoints or discussions, effectively censoring them.
So this leads to his really provocative claim that in trying to stop Trump from running, winning, or governing, the left has actually become anti-democratic in the name of democracy.
That's the core of his critique here. He introduces this idea of managed democracy.
Image democracy.
Yeah, a system where democratic outcomes are only really considered legitimate if they align with a certain elite consensus. If the wrong person wins or the wrong policies are favored, then the process itself is questioned or needs to be managed.
And he contrasts the two sides' reactions.
He does. He points to the GOP's relative respect for the process as he sees it during Biden's presidency, compared to what he describes as the left's almost blasphemy reaction to Trump.
Seeing Trump as a heretic?
A heretic who fundamentally disrupted their narrative of destiny, their expected path for the country.
Yeah.
So his conclusion is pretty stark. Both sides are now, in his colorful phrase, flying Death Stars. Nobody's just the scrappy rebels anymore.
Wow. Okay, so this internal warfare, this breakdown, leads to something even broader culturally. Abraham calls it the collapse of empathy under the weight of propaganda. This sounds bleak.
It is bleak. He uses a really specific, infamous example to anchor this. The Naira testimony from 1990.
The incubator story from the first Gulf War.
That's the one. The highly emotional testimony, later found to be staged, about Iraqi soldiers taking babies out of incubators. Abraham argues that was maybe the last time we wept and meant it collectively as a nation over something like that.
The last time empathy was genuine on that scale.
That's his point. Since then, he says, empathy has been reverse engineered into a weapon. It's used strategically, cynically, which leads to this widespread empathy fatigue. We're just worn out by the constant appeals.
And that leads to nihilism.
Ethical nihilism, he calls it. Feeling that maybe moral principles don't really matter or are just tools. In this kind of environment, he says, everything is content, everything is suspect. You can't trust appeals to emotion anymore.
He makes a truly chilling claim connected to this about violence. Nobody shoots because you have a baby. They shoot through your baby. What on earth does he mean by that?
It's brutal, isn't it? He's suggesting a profound level of desensitization, where the presence of a child, which should be the ultimate shield or deterrent, is no longer effective. It doesn't stop the violence, it's just collateral damage, or maybe not even seen.
And he links this to rhetoric about family.
Yeah, he argues that years of certain kinds of rhetoric, he mentions phrases like clumps of cells or the mocking of the traditional nuclear family, have had an effect.
What an effect.
That younger generations perhaps don't see families, they see entanglements. They don't instinctively rally around something like family separation at the border because, he controversially claims, they've been sort of trained to reject family as a core value.
Which brings us to another of his concepts, the icy cage paradox. How does that fit in?
He uses it to describe how the public outrage over immigrant detention centers, the so-called cages, seemed to fluctuate wildly depending on who was president.
So the outrage was selective, not consistent based on the actual conditions.
That's the paradox he identifies, and he connects this to another really cynical idea he calls colonial math with a DEI filter.
Okay, break that down. Colonial math, DEI filter.
It sounds complex, but he means a kind of grim calculation. On one side, he suggests the discourse says white natalism is evil. Encouraging white people to have more kids is seen negatively.
Right.
But on the other side, he argues brown fertility is strategic, meaning the importation of families from certain backgrounds is seen as useful, maybe to fill labor gaps or achieve demographic goals. And this is framed under the positive language of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
So a cynical calculation hidden behind progressive language.
That's his very provocative interpretation. That DEI is used as a filter to justify policies that might otherwise look like, well, colonial-style resource management, but with people.
Okay, and finally, looping back to Trump.
Yeah.
How does he operate in this world Abraham describes, this post-empathy landscape where shame doesn't seem to stick?
Abraham sees the whole Maggia movement as anti-fragile. You know Nassim Taleb's concept? Things that don't just withstand shocks, but actually get stronger from them.
So scandals make him stronger.
That's the idea. The movement metabolizes scandals, turns attacks into fuel. They become slogans, merchandise.
Like the mugshot?
Exactly. He calls Trump a meme engine, a shame-eater king. Every attack just feeds the beast. He turns his mugshot into this American Che Guevara icon.
And this is different from how the establishment handles scandals.
Starkly different, Abraham argues. He contrasts it with the typical establishment response: panic, deflect, and gaslight. Trump, instead, absorbs it, owns it, turns it into part of his myth.
So he's not just a politician anymore.
In Abraham's view, he's become a myth, a kind of meme warlord, operating entirely outside the old rules of political shame and accountability.
So if we try to tie all these threads
Yeah.
together, these deep dives into foreign policy, domestic politics, cultural shifts, it sounds like they all point to one fundamental breakdown.
Yeah, a really basic one.
We're not just arguing about policy anymore. We're arguing about what's real.
That's a huge recurring theme in Abraham's writing, isn't it? He sees it everywhere. Like in those online discussions where people genuinely believe, say, Elon elected the president, or the endless fights over stolen elections, even when the results are heavily audited and verified.
It's in the foreign policy stuff, too.
Absolutely. Diametrically opposed views on why 9/11 happened, for instance, and the weaponization of empathy we just talked about, this idea of managed democracy, it all feeds into this sense that we don't share a common factual basis.
Which raises a massive question. If we can't even agree on basic facts, how can we possibly do what Abraham suggests is needed for adult rebellion? How do you organize or build institutions?
Well, that's the troubling conclusion he reaches. He says, quite bluntly, no one in America agrees on what we means anymore.
Without that shared we, what hope is there for change?
Not much, according to him, without a coherent theory of power, a plausible replacement structure, and critically, a story that more than 3.5% of the country can agree on.
Then what do you have?
He warns, you don't have a revolution. You have a fever dream. A LARP. Basically, role-playing. A violent TikTok with better costume.
Oof, that's harsh.
It is. And the most disturbing part, he suggests maybe, just maybe, we're starting to prefer it that way, prefer the performance, the conflict, over the hard work of finding common ground.
Wow. That really was a lot to consider, wasn't it?
Hmm.
Chris Abraham paints this incredibly vivid, sometimes, unsettling picture of the world right now.
Definitely unsettling.
From those quiet operations of the soft power empire to the loud, almost performative battles we see in domestic politics.
Yeah, he sketches out a society where empathy is a tool, reality itself is up for grabs, and the old ways power worked are just constantly shifting.
It really makes you question the stories we're told, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And the stories we tell ourselves, and maybe even the stories we want to believe.
Indeed. It forces you, I think, to look under the surface at those currents of power and narrative that really shape how we see things and what we do.
So after this deep dive, maybe the question to leave you with is this. In a world where maybe every action is performance and every truth seems contested, what actually motivates people anymore? And what, if anything, can still genuinely move us?
Tough question.
Something to definitely ponder until our next deep dive.